Rolex is one of those names that stopped being just a company a long time ago. It became a signal people read instantly. Precision, status, control, permanence. The crown on the dial came to suggest something almost larger than a watch, as if the object on a wrist could hold back uncertainty itself. And that is exactly why this story should be told, because the brand that would come to represent security was built by someone who lost security early. So let me put the real question in front of you right away. How does a boy who loses both parents end up creating one of the most trusted names on earth? How does that gap get crossed? Because the distance between those 2 points is where the true story lives. We need to go back to Bavaria, long before Rolex meant power, long before its watches were linked with wealth and achievement, long before the wristwatch had earned the respect people later gave it without thinking. Back there, the future did not look crowned at all. Hans Wilsdorf was born in 1881 in Kulmbach in Bavaria. His family was not at the bottom of society. His father had a successful hardware business. From the outside, it could have looked stable, but life can turn on a child with very little warning. Wilsdorf lost his mother, then his father, and by the age of 12, he was an orphan. The family business was sold, and he and his siblings were placed in boarding schools. That kind of beginning leaves a mark. You do not come out of that untouched. You learn early that comfort is not fixed. You learn that the ground under a life can shift fast. And I think that helps explain almost everything that comes later. Some children grow up with an easy belief that the world will carry them. Wilsdorf did not. What he seems to have learned instead was self-command, discipline, usefulness, the habit of relying on structure when warmth is missing. He was good at mathematics. He was good with languages. Those sound like ordinary details until you see what they reveal. He had a mind that could organize, calculate, translate, adjust. He was not only smart, he was adaptable. That is different. Intelligence by itself is common enough. The sharper gift is learning how to stay effective in unstable conditions, and that is one of the first signs that something unusual was already forming in him. But there's another layer here, and it runs deeper than talent. When a person loses stability young, one response is drift. Another is to develop a private hunger for order. Not grand speeches about success, not fantasy, something colder and more practical, a need to build systems that do not fall apart so easily. With Wilsdorf, that impulse seems to appear early. There was no great inheritance waiting for him, no family empire to step into, no protective cushion. His start was not romantic, it was exposed. He had to become useful in the world quickly. His first work did not look like the opening scene of a legend. He joined an international pearl export company, where he learned business habits, correspondence, and the mechanics of trade. That may sound small, but these early jobs were doing something important inside him. They were teaching him how goods move, how trust moves, how information moves. He was learning that commerce is never just about the object, it is also about confidence. Then came the shift that quietly changed the direction of his life. He moved into the Swiss watch trade in La Chaux-de-Fonds, working for a watch firm as a clerk and English correspondent. On paper, it sounds modest. In reality, it placed him right inside a world built on precision, timing, reputation, and export. He handled watches. He saw how they were made, how they were sold, how quality was discussed, how reliability could succeed or fail in the eyes of the buyer. He was still young. He had no famous name. He was not some master watchmaker emerging from legend, but he was in the middle of a system that fit his mind almost too well. Here is why I think this part is easy to overlook. Many people could have stood in the same room, watched the same trade, and learned only the technical side. Wilsdorf seems to have absorbed something wider. He understood mechanics, yes, but he also understood image, presentation, credibility, language, distribution. He was not thinking only about what a product is. He was already feeling his way toward the harder question, which is how a product becomes believed in. And that is where the first hidden crack appears beneath the rise. The wristwatch, at that time, was not an obvious road to greatness.
Pocket watches carried more respect, especially for men. Wristwatches were often seen as decorative, secondary, even weak. The category itself had a credibility problem. That should have pushed a cautious person away. If you wanted safety, you would not build your future around something the market still half dismissed. But Wilsdorf did not seem drawn to what was safe. He was drawn to openings other people failed to value. That tells you something important about the way his mind worked. He could feel possibility where others saw limitation. He could sense that a product people underestimated might become powerful if someone solved the trust problem around it. Not just the engineering problem, the trust problem. And I think that connects directly back to his childhood. A boy who grows up without dependable ground may become unusually alert to the price of confidence. He knows what it means when it is missing. He knows how people respond when they are unsure. So when Wilsdorf looked at watches, he may have seen more than metal and movement. He may have seen a category waiting for someone to make it feel secure. That is a different level of vision. It is not only about invention, it is about reading human doubt and deciding to build against it. By then, the pattern was already visible, even if the future was not. He was disciplined, he was observant, he could move between languages and markets, he had learned to function without softness. He had entered a business where precision and reputation were tied together, and he was drawn not to the settled center, but to an insecure edge where belief had not fully formed. That is not the setup for a calm rise. It is the setup for risk. Because once you choose a path like that, you do not just need a good product. You need to change what people think is possible. You need to force respect where none is freely given. And if you fail, you do not disappear gently. You expose yourself. By 1905, still in his 20s, Hans Wilsdorf was ready to act. He was about to found a company in London with Alfred Davis. He was about to place his future on a form of watch many still did not take seriously. And that is where the story opens wider, because the rise was no longer only beginning, it was beginning to demand something from him.
That demand changed everything. In London, with Alfred Davis beside him, Hans Wilsdorf stopped behaving like a young man looking for a place in the trade and started acting like someone trying to bend the trade toward a different future. The decision at the center of it was simple to describe and dangerous to bet on. He chose the wristwatch, not as an accessory, not as a small side business while the respectable money stayed with pocket watches. He treated it as the form that would one day win, even while much of the market still looked at it with doubt. That is where I think the rise becomes more than effort. A lot of people work hard. Fewer can see that the world is about to move and place themselves where it will arrive. Wilsdorf saw that timekeeping was shifting from something tucked away in a pocket to something visible, worn, immediate, part of daily movement. But seeing that opening was only the first layer. He also understood the real barrier. The wristwatch had an image problem. Many men still saw it as decorative, even flimsy. So the question was not just how to make one, the question was how to make the public trust one. That became his method. He built from trust outward. He sourced small, precise Swiss movements, especially from Egler in Bienne, because if the wristwatch was going to replace older habits, it could not feel second-rate. It had to perform with seriousness. It had to earn confidence every single time someone looked down at their wrist. And that was already a sharper idea than people around him were using. He was not merely assembling watches, he was designing credibility. Then came one of those decisions that can look minor until you realize it changed everything. He gave the business a name the world could carry. Rolex. Short, clean, memorable. Easy to pronounce in different languages, easy to print on a dial, easy to retain in the mind. That was not style for its own sake, it was compression. He took a product people were still learning how to value and gave it a name strong enough to travel faster than explanation. You can hear the strategic discipline in that choice. Wilsdorf was stripping away resistance at every level. The product had to work. The name had to stick. The image had to feel modern. The public had to remember it after one glance. But even that would not be enough.
because he knew something many founders learned too late. You cannot simply say a doubtful product is reliable and expect the world to believe you. You have to prove it through outside judgment, through visible tests, through symbols the buyer already respects. So he chased precision certificates. In 1910, a Rolex wristwatch received a Swiss certificate for chronometric precision. 4 years later, a Rolex wristwatch received a Class A certificate from Kew Observatory in Britain, the kind of rating normally associated with marine chronometers. That was a real break in the story. The wristwatch was no longer trapped in the language of fashion. It had entered the language of performance. Here is why that shift was so powerful. Wilsdorf was not waiting for culture to slowly come around. He was accelerating the change by borrowing authority from institutions people already trusted. He turned technical approval into public leverage. He made the category stronger by making Rolex the example that forced people to reconsider the category itself. That is a much bigger move than selling a good product. That is using proof to redraw the terms of the market. And once he started doing that, the rise gathered force. Product, certification, branding, and timing began to line up. The world was changing too. Wristwatches became more practical in modern life, especially as habits shifted during the early 20th century. But Wilsdorf did not ride that wave passively. He helped define what the wave would look like. He kept pushing the idea that the wristwatch could be precise, masculine, elegant, and durable all at once. Still, the climb was carrying pressure inside it from the start. Every promise he made tightened the standard around him. If Rolex stood for accuracy, then any weakness became more dangerous. If Rolex stood for trust, then failure would cut deeper than it would for an ordinary maker. Success was giving him scale, but it was also removing his room for error. And the world outside the company was not steady either. World War I disrupted trade and put pressure on business conditions in Britain. Import duties on Swiss watches complicated the economics. This is where Wilsdorf's thinking shows another side. He was not sentimental about structure. He did not cling to London just because that is where he had started. He adapted. In 1920, Montres Rolex SA was registered in Geneva, placing the brand in a stronger position for the long term. That decision tells you a lot about him. He was not building around personal attachment. He was building around survival and expansion. He wanted the company in the place where it could grow with the least friction and the most control. That same pattern keeps appearing. He saw the future early. He shaped perception. He used outside proof. Then, when conditions changed, he restructured without nostalgia. The rise was not random. It was built on a repeated habit of reducing weakness before weakness could reduce him. Then came the breakthrough that made Rolex feel larger than a watch company. In 1926, Rolex introduced the Oyster, the first waterproof and dustproof wristwatch. On its own, that was a major engineering advance. But the deeper brilliance lies in what Wilsdorf did next. He did not leave the claim sitting in a brochure. He turned it into a public demonstration. In 1927, swimmer Mercedes Gleitz wore a Rolex Oyster during her attempt to swim the English Channel. After more than 10 hours in the water, the watch was still working. Wilsdorf turned the event into a statement the public could not miss, placing a full-page advertisement on the front page of the Daily Mail. Look at what is happening there. He is not just selling waterproofing. He is staging a test in the real world, attaching the watch to endurance, danger, exposure, and proof. He is making engineering visible to people who will never open the case or study the mechanism. That is the hidden engine. Wilsdorf understood that belief grows faster when performance is seen under pressure. He made the watch do something the public could picture. Suddenly, Rolex was not only precise in a workshop, it was resilient in the world. And that pushed the brand into another category entirely. It began to stand for something beyond function. It suggested control under stress, security in motion, reliability when conditions turn rough. But there was a deeper tension gathering beneath the polish. The more Rolex became a symbol of certainty, the more demanding that symbol became. People were no longer buying only a timekeeper. They were buying reassurance. They were buying the feeling that this object would not fail them. That creates its own burden. A brand built on confidence has to keep feeding confidence or risk collapse of a different kind, not mechanical but psychological. Wilsdorf kept driving forward. In 1931, Rolex introduced the perpetual rotor, a self-winding mechanism that became central to the modern automatic wristwatch. Again, the move was technical, but the message underneath stayed the same. Less interruption, less fragility, more continuity. The whole brand was becoming an answer to uncertainty, and the more clearly you see that, the more personal the rise begins to feel. He was not only refining products, he was building a system that tried to close every opening where doubt could enter. That is powerful. It is also revealing, because when a company is built with that level of control, you start to sense that the rise is carrying something unspoken inside it. The success is real, the strategy is brilliant, the reputation is earned, but beneath all of it sits an older force, one that does not come from watches at all. It comes from loss, from insecurity, from the refusal to let the ground disappear again. And once that becomes visible, the story turns darker, because what looked like pure triumph begins to reveal the private pressure driving it.
And that private pressure finally comes into full view when you look at what success did not solve. By the middle of his life, Hans Wilsdorf had done what almost nobody from his beginning could reasonably expect to do. He had helped turn the wristwatch from a doubtful object into something modern, respected, and desired. Rolex had become more than a maker of watches. It had become a sign of control, proof, and endurance. But the old wound was still there, only dressed in finer clothes. The rise did not erase the first fear. It gave that fear better tools. You can feel that in the way the company kept evolving. Sealed cases, tested movements, public demonstrations, tight control over the brand, long-term independence. None of this looks accidental. It looks like the work of a man who never fully trusted chaos to stay away. I think that is the hardest truth in the story. Some people build to get rich. Some build to be admired. Wilsdorf certainly became successful, but the deeper force seems older than ambition. He was building against collapse. He was trying to make something that would hold. That gives the whole rise a different emotional shape. Because the brand the world came to associate with certainty was built by someone who learned certainty could vanish early. Then life hit that old wound again. In 1944, his wife, Florence, died suddenly. Rolex's own telling of his life says that at 63, he was a widower with no descendants, and that after her death, he turned his mind towards securing the future of the enterprise he had built. That is not a small detail buried at the edge of the story. It changes the whole final movement. By then, he had achieved the wealth, the prestige, the scale, but the person who had shared the long climb with him was gone. And if you listen closely, the shape of his response tells you everything. He did not slow down into comfort. He did not cash out. He did not let the company drift into ordinary inheritance. In 1945, he created the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, and Rolex says the company is still owned by that foundation and able to keep developing independently under the founder's values. That decision carries a lot of emotional weight. It was legal, financial, and strategic, yes, but it was also personal. The orphan who had once lost the structure around his life became the older man who refused to let the thing he built become vulnerable to the same kind of uncertainty. He had no children, his wife was gone, and the answer he chose was not bloodline, but permanence through structure. Here is where the story becomes deeper than a business success. Rolex did not stay private by accident. It stayed private because Wilsdorf wanted continuity without the usual pressures that tear companies away from their original logic. No public shareholders, no quarterly theater, no easy sale, no handing the company over to whatever force happened to arrive next. He built a wall around the future, and the strange thing is, that choice still shapes Rolex today. Official company material says the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation remains the shareholder,
and outside industry reporting says Rolex rarely makes public statements about its finances and operations. So when people talk about Rolex as if it is only a luxury brand, they are missing the hidden architecture. The watches were one achievement, the structure was another. Wilsdorf did not just create products that lasted, he created an institution designed to resist the usual forms of decay. And that is where the cost shows itself in a quieter way. Because to build something this controlled, this protected, this exact, you usually give up a certain softness. You live by standards that do not relax easily. You turn reliability into a moral demand. You keep tightening the system because weakness feels dangerous. I am not saying that as gossip or invented psychology. I'm saying it because the pattern is visible in what he built and in the choices he made late in life.
The fear of instability never really left the room. It just became elegant. And since you asked about net worth, here is the honest answer. There is no clean, reliable public figure for Hans Wilsdorf's personal net worth in the way people talk about modern billionaires. Rolex stayed private, and later its ownership went to the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, so the company never developed the kind of public market value or personal wealth disclosure that makes those numbers easy to pin down. But the scale of what he built is still clear. Industry estimates reported by Hodinkee from Morgan Stanley and Lux Consult say Rolex topped $11 billion in sales in 2025 and accounted for about one-third of the Swiss watch industry sales. So even if Wilsdorf's own fortune cannot be neatly boxed into a trusted number, the size of the machine he created is beyond doubt. It became one of the largest and most powerful names in luxury on Earth. Yet that scale only sharpens the final irony. The bigger Rolex became, the easier it was for the public to misunderstand what it really represented. People see the money, they see the waiting lists, the steel sports models, the prestige, the resale premiums, the aura. They assume the story ends with wealth. But wealth is not the deepest ending here. The real story is that Wilsdorf turned insecurity into system. He took a childhood marked by loss and built a company obsessed with proof. He took a life that began with dependence stripped away and built a brand whose whole identity was reliability. He took the fear of things slipping out of one's hands and answered it with engineering, branding, structure, and time itself. That is why Rolex lasted. Not just because the watches were good, not just because the marketing was brilliant, not just because the company stayed private. It lasted because the force behind it was painfully consistent from beginning to end. The boy who learned early that life can come apart became the man who spent decades trying to create objects, messages, and institutions that would not come apart so easily. Even his final act follows the same line. He made sure the company would continue beyond him, held by a foundation rather than exposed to the usual scramble after a founder's death. So the final truth is not shiny at all. Success did not heal the first injury, it organized itself around it. Rolex became public confidence built around private insecurity. And maybe that is why the story still stays with you after the facts are over. Because beneath the crown, beneath the polished case, beneath the image of wealth and certainty, there is still a child who learned too soon that safety can disappear. Hans Wilsdorf never fully escaped that lesson. He mastered it. He turned it into a company, and the world spent the next century wearing the result on its wrist.